Hi there, welcome back to the Rum Ration, where we explore the human experience in military history, always with a tot of rum, of course. I'm Rejoy.
And I'm Colin. And today we're taking a closer look at the Second Battle of Ypres, specifically the role played by our beloved, the Royal Montreal Regiment, the 14th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. This was a brutal and defining moment in Canada's First World War history and a grim coming of age on the Western Front.
Yeah, indeed. So let's set the stage here. The war has been going on for about nearly a year now. Begins in April 1915. The 1st Canadian Division has just taken over a 4,250-yard stretch of the Ypres salient, which is what we've been talking about all this while. So right now, at this point, when you hear the words Ypres salient, that should already send a shiver down your spine knowing what's to come. That vulnerable bulge in the Allied lines in Belgium, where the enemy held the high ground and visibility on 3 sides. The Canadians, still relatively new to this war, stepped into a front line already soaked in mud, misery, and menace. Setting the stage, because we'd made reference to the soldiers hunching up their shoulders in heavy bullet fire, kind of like in a heavy rain or a snowstorm. Future CEO of the RMR, George Brewer, saw action at Ypres when he recalled, quote, "People were blown up all around us, bodies flying in the air. They just blew us out of that position, and we had orders to retire. And retirement was up to a long slope right out in the open. No cover at all. The bullets were, well, it was just like being out in a rainstorm."
Unbelievable. Wow. That really sets the stage all right. The RMR, the 14th Battalion, was positioned on the left of the Canadian line, right next to French colonial troops, the Turcos of the French Algerian divisions. The trenches they occupied? Appalling. Waterlogged with minimal protection. The parapets were thin. The dugouts almost non-existent. And the dead, well, they were buried shallow or not at all. You can imagine the stench.
Sniper fire was constant. We spoke about this earlier as well, the deadliness of the snipers on the Western Front. Fatigue was a daily companion. And yet morale held. The Canadians had recently been trained in trench warfare alongside experienced British troops. And while no training could fully prepare them for what was coming, they were willing, eager even. The 14th took over the left subsector of the 3rd Brigade's trenches on April 16th. They rotated out after 5 days.
It's important to understand that they were rotating out as things changed because they were pulled back to the billets in Saint Jean, except for No. 2 Company. They were left in Saint Julien as a reserve unit for the 13th Battalion, our good friends at the Black Watch. And that placement would prove tragic for No. 2 Company. But before we get to that,
Yes, hold steady, because it's time for our traditional Wish We Had a Sponsor segment. And today we raise our canteen cups to Pusser's Rum. Strong, smooth, and as essential to morale as clean socks. Pussers. If it was any more integral to this podcast, we'd be issued it with our ration cards.
which we're not
No.
yet. But
Yeah.
Pussers, if you're listening, our canteen cups are standing by.
Yes. Okay, back to the podcast. So let's imagine the scene. April 22nd, 1915. Dawn quiet and clear. Birds were singing. The air was warm. But by mid-afternoon, that peace was shattered. At 3 p.m., the Germans launched a devastating artillery bombardment across the entire Ypres salient. It was the opening salvo of a new kind of war. When the attack opened, No. 2 Company of the RMR lay in billets in Saint-Julien. Unlike the rest of the 14th Battalion, which moved towards Saint-Julien, No. 2 Company was part of a special reserve under the orders of Lieutenant Colonel Loomis, the 13th Battalion, the Black Watch.
So at 5 p.m., witnesses saw a yellow-green cloud rolling towards the French lines. It was chlorine gas, the first mass use of chemical weapons in modern warfare. And if you go back to our previous episode, you can get a deep dive into the history and use of gas warfare. And the French Algerian troops had no protection, like any of the troops in the line. And many fled in terror. Their lungs were seared, their comrades dying. The Allied line buckled. You can go back to our previous 2 episodes to get a deep dive into the specifics and the strategic implication of Ypres and what would happen if that collapsed, if the line did fall apart, and would have probably ended the war a lot sooner and not the way we would have hoped. You can also get a deep dive into the horrors of gas warfare.
Yes, that's right. I mean, as we covered in an earlier episode, Colin spoke very eloquently to some of the effects of gas warfare and how not just terrifying the psychological aspect of it is, but what the physical effects later were and how they manifested themselves as the war went on and after the war as well. So anyway, back to this battle. A gaping hole opened to the left of the Canadian positions. Orders came quickly. The Canadians had to hold. And so the 14th, alongside other battalions of the 3rd Brigade, surged forward to plug the breach. Sergeant W.C. Volkert later recalled the night of April 22nd as unforgettable. Smoke, confusion, and overwhelming enemy pressure.
In the middle of all this was Captain Richard Steacie, the second in command of No. 2 Company. Born in Ireland and significantly older than the average frontline officer, he was 44 years old. Steacie brought experience and steadiness to his role. He was in Saint Julien where his company had been stationed as reserve to the 13th Battalion. But when the French broke and the Germans poured through the gap, Saint Julien was no longer a rear area. He rejoined. He not only was he old and could have gotten out of service just around his age, he certainly had the means to live in comfort. I looked up his address. He lived on Summit Circle in Westmount.
Wow. For those of you who are not familiar with Montreal, Westmount is the home of the very wealthy, privileged, old money, and he certainly didn't have to volunteer and go at that time, but like so many, he did. And the life that he gave up to do this is quite amazing. Um, like many other Canadians, also who were fortunate enough to be in privileged circumstances, also gave up their lives and their living and went over across. And so Steacie and his men were swept into the frontline fight, quite unexpectedly. Chlorine gas was everywhere. Vision was poor. Men were choking, vomiting, on the verge of being panicked. Major Hansen, the OC of No. 2 Company, was wounded and ordered Steacie to take over. Steacie, who had been supervising the issue of additional ammunition to his troops, immediately took command. In the midst of trying to organize his company and issue orders, Captain Steacie was shot in the neck. He died where he fell, in the chaos and confusion of a battlefield unlike anything seen before. Can
And
you
for
imagine
years,
being in that? I
yeah,
mean,
I can
just
imagine.
all this stuff is happening, and you've just had to take over and rally the men and create some sort of discipline and order to the situation, and then bang.
Well, it gives you an idea of just like the chaos too. I mean, first the company commander gets wounded, then another company officer gets wounded, and then you get told you're in charge, and then you get killed. You imagine the poor NCOs and
Yeah.
soldiers trying to, okay, who's in charge? Where do we go?
What do we
What's
do
going
now?
on?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that it's probably a near state of panic was bubbling under the surface there. So the tragic thing about Dick Steacie was that for years he lay in a grave marked only as, quote, an unknown captain of the 14th Battalion, which, you know, an unknown private, I get it. There's several hundred tragically, of unknown privates of the RMR with no known grave, but unknown captain. I mean, there's like, how many captains in a battalion? Like 5, 6?
That's right.
You
Yeah.
know, there's
Yeah.
5, 6 of us for breakfast, and there's only 5 at lunch. Where's Frank? Like, so but I think the story really tells about the fluid nature of this battle. It wasn't your typical trench where they were just fighting it out. It was ranging over kilometers, going forward and backwards and backwards and forward. So the body, when it was found, all the personal effects have been taken off of it, because I guess whoever had taken those were going to, turn those in for burial afterwards, and they
Yeah.
probably got killed themselves. So that was never turned in. So whenever his body was eventually discovered, they could tell by the markings on the uniform that it was, with the 3 pips, that he was a
There's a
captain,
captain. Yeah.
and by the cap badge it said the RMR. But it wasn't until nearly a century later that his remains were correctly identified. And it's a big thanks to Michel Gravel, who's a friend of the show. So shout out to Michel, who's written a couple of books about the RMR and members of the RMR, and has done a ton to make sure that the RMR and all Canadians are properly commemorated for what they did in World War One. And also Grant Furholter, who I'm going to say is not a friend of the show. That bugger confirmed on Thursday that he's yet to listen to any episodes. So
Is
screw
there an
him.
affiliation with Pusser's Rum? with Grant
Yeah,
and
exactly. I think
Osler.
Grant
I
secretly works
think,
for them. I think
I
Grant
think,
secretly works for them. Yeah,
you know,
but actually, Grant does work for Air Canada. And when the headstone got changed, because Grant did all the paperwork at the time, submitted the request to get the ball rolling at the Commonwealth Grave Commission. And then when they did the verification, they got in touch with the Steacie family, and they decided, okay, that is Richard or Dick Steacie buried under there, and we'll change the headstone. Grant arranged for Air Canada Cargo, who very generously donated to go pick up the grave marker. And these things are heavy, like big chunks of granite, and they flew it back to Montreal, where it can be viewed today as part of the RMR Museum's permanent collection. One of very few headstones that have ever been returned to Canada. So Captain Stacie's great granddaughter, Pam Steacie, visited the newly marked grave and later said her French friends from France were deeply moved, saying that they were grateful to men like Richard who'd fought to keep their country free. And specifically, and this is on the RMR website, Pam wrote in 2015, quote, "4 of my French friends decided to visit the grave in Belgium. They were very moved by the story of his life and death and the identification of his grave. They also feel very grateful. They feel that it is thanks in part to Captain Richard Steacie and those who fought with him that they, my friends, are still French and not German." End quote.
wow, wow, it's powerful stuff. And Captain Steacie was the first RMR officer KIA. He died on the very first day of the Second Battle of Ypres. He never saw the line stabilize. He never saw the Canadian reinforcements arrive. But in his sacrifice and that of his company, the tide of the German advance was slowed.
And speaking of slowing the tide, another of the great stories of this battle belongs to Captain Francis Scrimger, who was
Mm-hmm.
the RMR's medical officer. On April 25th, so a few days after the gas attack, Scrimger was tending the wounded in a farmhouse being used as an advanced dressing station near the brigade headquarters when it came under direct shell fire. He was ordered to the rear, but refused. Instead, he went to the general headquarters trenches occupied by some of the RMR companies there. Under fire, he dressed the wounds of at least 5 badly injured men before returning to the farmhouse dressing station. Now, this dressing station was known as Shelltrap Farm, which was appropriately nicknamed, as we'll see, because he had approximately 30 or 40 patients that he was treating in this farmhouse. But he realized the incredible danger they were in because the stretchers that the wounded were lying in were raised up off the ground, sitting on these nice wooden crates of ammunition. Yeah. So road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Approximately 350,000 rounds were ready to cook off as soon as the shell landed too close.
Well, to be fair, the boys obviously knew the danger of the situation. Not that they were going to move the crates of ammo. It's just, well, what's a good name for this place? Shelltrap Farm. Let's call it that, because you know what's going to happen. So, well, rather than retreat himself, as the shelling intensified, Scrimger ordered the evacuation of the wounded. When one officer, Captain H.F. MacDonald, could not be moved due to severe head injuries, Scrimger ordered everyone else out, and he stayed behind. Shells fell around the farm, and the building was demolished and set on fire. Scrimger, however, shielded MacDonald's body and continued to work on it. Blinded by smoke and heat, Scrimger pulled the larger officer onto his back and staggered out, crossing a moat to escape advancing German infantry. They lay in a ditch under shell fire, with Scrimger curling himself around MacDonald to protect him. For his valor and devotion, Captain Scrimger was awarded the Victoria Cross, the first Canadian officer to receive this honor in the Great War.
Yeah, it's important to note there, it says the larger officer, Scrimger, or Scrimmy as he was known, was not a big guy. He was very, very small and very light, very wiry. So for him to be able to pick up that guy and carry him through the shell fire, pretty impressive. But
And for
Scrimger's,
any, any new recruits who may be listening, this is why, the fireman's carry and all those drills that you're doing right now, this is why they're important.
that's right. And if you are a recruit in the RMR or anyone else, and you're wondering what one of those portraits up on the
Yes.
balcony are, full painting, that's one of them. We got our 2 Victoria Cross winners, and of course one of them is Scrimger. So you can go take a look. The Scrimger story has another layer. Some say that he helped recover and encourage the publication of John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields. In fact, the Canadian War Museum reports that from his school days at McGill, Scrimger had known John McCrae, and the older McCrae, who had served in South Africa as a gunner and was an accomplished poet and doctor, had written in Flanders Fields after the Second Battle of Ypres. It is said that McCrae, upon scribbling the poem out in a few minutes, read it over, unsatisfied with it, crumpled it up, and threw it away. And apparently, Scrimger picked it up and convinced McCrae to send it to Punch magazine, where it was eventually published.
Yeah, that's right. I've heard that story too. What a lot of people also don't know is about John McCrae himself. Maybe sometime we can do an episode about
Mm-hmm.
him. That it was one of the most famous war poems of the First World War in
Absolutely.
Flanders Fields was written by a Canadian officer. Uh, something
And
something to keep in
is
mind.
written around the dressing room of the Montreal Canadiens.
Exactly so. Exactly so. I mean, that alone is something quite moving if for us as RMRs. So courage and chaos, from officers to stretcher bearers. One private recalled a young English bugler who tried to carry him to safety and was killed instantly by shrapnel. Another stretcher bearer picked him up next and was also shot. He eventually crawled to safety on his own. The private's name has been lost to history, but his words were captured in an article in the Ottawa Citizen, published on 30th April 1915. Quote, I did not think the wound in my leg, practically in 3 places, was so bad, but eventually I had to give way. A bugler, a young courageous fellow of an English regiment, picked me up in the open. Bullets from machine guns were flying around, as well as shrapnel. He was practically carrying me when the shrapnel burst over our heads. He was struck in the chest and killed instantly. I fell and crawled to a place behind a turnip patch, where I lay until picked up by a stretcher bearer. We had not gone far, he carrying me, until he also was shot. Shortly after, I was taken to a dressing station. Hard to imagine such horror.
Unbelievable. Poor
And I will
bastard gets.
never again make fun of turnip patches as
No,
well.
you shouldn't.
So,
No, you shouldn't.
because
But the poor
obviously,
bastard, you get wounded twice.
yeah.
2 people go out to save him, and they get killed trying to save him. Can you imagine trying to live with that for the rest of your life as well? Like, God.
I'm sure
But
there are
here,
many stories like that as well, right? I mean,
oh
my
yeah,
God, my
absolutely.
God.
And here's another connection to Ypres and the Victoria Cross. While Scrimger the RMR earned the second Canadian VC of the war and the first officer, the first ever awarded to a Canadian was awarded to another Montreal unit, the Black Watch, also with a Westmount and an RMR connection.
So I'm sure, again, this is one of those famous stories, uh, story of this young man um, who won the Victoria Cross, the Black Watch. So the story goes, Lieutenant Colonel Loomis detailed a party of 60 men, which was led by Lieutenant Stairs of the 14th Battalion, RMR, which
From that
included
second company that had been detached as part of the reserve. Yeah.
exactly, which included a machine gun crew headed by 19-year-old Fred Fisher, and this is the name that later has become quite famous,
Mhm.
to close a gap in the line and provide cover for Major King to withdraw his battery, which had been firing at the Germans over open sights. When you're firing over open sights, I mean, for those of you who may not be familiar with that, that means you can see those buggers coming at you. That's open sights.
They're firing their cannons, their
Like,
artillery pieces. We should
sorry,
be very
that's right.
clear here. Yeah, Major King
That's
was
right.
a artillery officer with his artillery howitzers that he's firing over
That's right.
directly at the enemy. Yeah,
Generally, they don't want to see the enemy. They want to
no,
give us the coordinates and, like, I'll put down
indirect
fire.
fire. Yeah,
But
indirect
all
fire.
of a sudden, there you are. There they are. They're coming.
So Fisher needed help with a machine gun. Private Palin from the 14th Battalion RMR, who was part of Number 2 Company that formed part of the Black Watch's Saint Julien garrison, remarked in hindsight, quote, we were out in the sun doing a bit of cleaning up, and the first thing we knew, we got a stand to. And I remember one Lance Corporal Fred Fisher of the 13th Battalion. He came down looking for 8 volunteers to carry up a machine gun. So 8 of us stepped out, end quote. Just barely out of Westmount High School, but showing the skill of a veteran. Fisher led his crew forward under heavy fire and set up his Colt machine gun in an isolated building, which enjoyed a commanding view of the enemy. In the fading light, the Germans attacked again and again, only to be driven back each time. Members of his crew went down one by one, but Fisher kept working the gun, ripping and spraying the enemy's ranks.
Fisher contributed in no small measure to checking the German advance and providing cover for Major King to successfully withdraw his guns. Attached to teams of horses, King instructed his drivers to forge ahead any way you can to get out. The guns made it back to Saint Julien. For his skill and daring, Fisher was awarded the Victoria Cross, the first Canadian soldier in the Great War to receive the honor. He was given the medal posthumously, for regrettably, he was killed in action the next day. There's still a large memorial to his honor in the entrance of the Westmount High School, and the school makes him the focal point of their annual Remembrance Day ceremonies. Colin, the other thing that strikes me, though, for that heroic action, deservedly so, Fred Fisher wins the Victoria Cross. But he also had his team around him, the 8 men there, and they all went down as well. So it's important to remember that there were also other soldiers there who didn't make it out.
That's right. And his crew he was the one leading the weapon and firing, but his crew were all RMRs, and they were all killed or wounded in supporting of him. And I've had the honor of being able to preside over a couple of Remembrance Day ceremonies at Westmount High School, which is just down the road from the RMR. And they do really make a big deal about Fred Fisher, as they should.
As they should.
Chaplain Canon F.G. Scott also enters the picture here. We've talked about him in previous episodes and how he was not necessarily one for following military decorum, practice, or orders. Kind of did whatever the fuck he wanted, as any good Padre should. Hearing of a counterattack involving the 14th, he rushed forward to join them. He couldn't find them, but he got swept up and joined an attack with the 10th and the 16th battalions. Armed only with a walking stick, because he was a Padre, he helped the wounded and offered comfort as shells burst around him. What an incredible man. We'll have to do an entire episode just about Canon Scott.
Oh, yes, we definitely have to. No doubt about it. So Second Ypres wasn't just a stand. It was a crucible. In 4 days, the Canadians held a line the Germans thought they had broken. They absorbed the shock of a new kind of warfare and denied the enemy a breakthrough, but at immense cost.
Yeah, that cost was quite something. I think we gave the numbers of 17,000 and change, the total number in the First Canadian Division that had crossed from England into France, and now up here in Belgium. So there were more than 6,500 Canadian casualties, so a full third, and of those, over 2,000 were killed. The RMR suffered heavily. Entire sections wiped out. Among the 30 men of Number 4 Company who were detached to help another unit retreat, only a few came back. The 14th Battalion, Royal Montreal Regiment, after the Second Battle of Ypres, reported casualties including 4 officers killed, 8 officers wounded, 65 other ranks killed, 143 other ranks killed, and 49 taken prisoner. Prisoner is something we don't think of and don't talk about much in World War I. So that's 210 casualties in a couple of days fighting. That's full 20-25% of the regimental strength.
Again, we're talking about large numbers in previous episodes, and in comparison, these numbers may not hit you as hard. But I want you to just sort of imagine the parade square in the armory.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll put it in perspective of how many RMRs did not make it out. A monument stands today in Saint Julien. It marks the spot where 18,000 Canadians faced the first poison gas attack. The inscription notes that 2,000 fell and are buried there. That's not a statistic. That's a brigade.
Yeah,
gone, gone,
dead. Yeah, and if anyone wants to see that, the cover art for this episode has the top part of the brooding soldier. It's called. It's a soldier carved in granite, resting on arms reversed, which I find very, very powerful.
Very powerful indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. General Sir John French, who was the overall British commander, credited the Canadians with saving a line. He called their stand, quote, a magnificent display of tenacity and courage, averted as a disaster which might have been attended with the most serious consequences, end quote. A fitting tribute, but quite an understatement that only scratches the surface of what was endured.
So, as we raise our glasses,
we once again toast to Pusser's Rum, who are ignoring us, not officially fueling their Rum Ration podcast, but spiritually, we like to think they're keeping the flame of Rum Ration around the world burning.
Smooth as a Scrimger under pressure and stronger than the Canadian line at Saint Julien, Pusser's, the rum we wish we had.
Hint, hint. Here's to the Royal Montreal Regiment at Ypres, to Colour Sergeant Price, to Captain Richard Steacie, to Sergeant Worrell, to Captain Scrimger, and to our beloved Padre, Chaplain Scott, and all the nameless and remembered men who stood in that yellow-green hell.
and to those who carried them out, who held the line, dug in under fire, and made the name Canadian something new on the world stage. This podcast episode is about remembering their efforts and their sacrifices. There are some key ways the battle is remembered and continues to resonate today. The Second Battle of Ypres holds a central place in the RMR's history and continues to be recognized through specific annual dinners, solemn traditions linked to memorials, its status as a foundational battle of honor, and the ongoing effort to remember and share the experiences and sacrifices of the soldiers who fought there.
Yeah, it's important to note the RMR Warrant Officers and Sergeants Mess, they hold an annual heap dinner to keep that memory alive.
That's right.
It was this battle that really brought home the horrors of the First World War. And spoiler alert, it wasn't going to get better over the next 3 years for them.
Sadly not. Thanks for listening to the Rum Ration, for joining us today. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it, rate it, drop us a line at rumration.ca. And if you happen to work at Pusser's Rum, you know what you need to do. Give us a call or email us or text us.
Anything.
Until
next time, keep your boots dry, your spirits up, and remember the stories that shape our world.
Cheers to history.